Well, typically I teach verse by verse through books of the Bible, and of course we spent 2.5 years in the Gospel of Luke and finished up in the spring, and then went through the Psalms, some Psalms this summer. But today I'm doing something a little bit different. We've done it once before of taking a break from our verse by verse exposition to do more of a theological series. And so that's what we're starting today, and I'm calling it Finding Your Way in the Religious Maze. Religion presents this bewildering maze of perspectives, and I think some people prefer to avoid it entirely. But is that even possible? I mean, think about it. If you choose to be non-religious, aren't you making a fundamentally religious assertion? I mean, doesn't that choice lead you to a certain set of coordinates, so to speak, in the maze of how you answer life's ultimate questions? And so that's where we begin to map out this spiritual landscape, is by asking, is there something more? And by hearing from two people who say no. So let me explain how I approach the maze. I love libraries. I love the quiet atmosphere. I love the smell of old books. In fact, some of the biggest decisions of my life tie back to one particular library on the campus of the University of Southern California. The Edward L. Doheny Jr. Memorial Library is a spectacular place. It was completed back in 1932 with a $1 million donation from a wealthy oil tycoon whose 35-year-old son, an alumnus of the school, had been murdered. And according, the campus of USC is in south central Los Angeles. Once you get off campus, it's not the nicest part of town. But as the architects built the building, they said this, quote, "The walls of pale Roman brick with cream-colored limestone trim, enlivened with colored marbles, are suggestive of the Romanesque styles of northern Italy." I mean, when you walk in, the main floor reading room has these lofty, ornate ceilings with soaring arched windows and gleaming marble floors and in brown and tan, this checkerboard. Buildings like a shrine to education and learning. Now, as a new freshman engineering student on the campus, I couldn't resist the building. But the books I wanted to read were not in the beautiful reading room. See, I had been a Christian for less than 2 years at that point, and I wanted to learn more about the Bible and theology. And so I wanted access to books like Strong's Exhaustive Concordance. Have you ever seen a concordance? It's 1,700 pages. It catalogs every word in the King James Version of the Bible and then links it to a numbered list of original Hebrew and Greek words. And so it's a tool that helps you study word meanings and trace themes through the Bible. I have my own copy now, but it's much easier to use a computer to do that sort of thing. So how do you find a Strong's Exhaustive Concordance in a massive library like that? Well, of course, you go to the card catalog. That was the way they used to do it, right? There's a reference system in the library, and the concordance was in the stacks, level 9. That's a sub-level, 9 floors down, underground, accessed by a dimly lit stairway or this rickety old elevator. It was in the section marked BS, for biblical studies, which was against the far wall from the elevator. It was in section number 425 with other linguistic Bible study tools on the bottom shelf, alphabetized by author's last name. Now, I had to go back and check a few of those details. I didn't remember all of them, but I do have very vivid memories of my time there because it was where I wrestled with first, the decision to give up my engineering scholarship and transfer to a Christian college to study Bible and theology. It was also the end point of a scavenger hunt I prepared to impress a certain young woman. I wrote a song and hid it in BS 425.S8. Who would ever use a musty old exhaustive concordance in sublevel 9 as a tool of romance. Thankfully, she's still married to me. So my point is just to say that we need a reference system like that to find our way through the religious maze. It should clarify where there are similarities and where there are differences. It should help us discern what issues are most significant and why they matter for everyday life. So in this 12-part series, I'm going to share my system. And I'm going to use 6 key questions to map the spiritual landscape. Now, of course, I'm not an impartial observer. Right? These questions flow from my frame of reference as an evangelical Christian, and before we're through, I'll explain what that terminology means. But we begin with the broad distinctions between world religions, and then we'll work our way inwards through the disagreements throughout history that have prompted the various disagreements and denominations within Christianity, ending up at where I stand and where we stand as a church theologically. But to keep this journey accurate and personal, I've interviewed local people from other standpoints so that you can hear their views in their own words. The first question in this whole reference system, the one we start with today, and we'll come back to it next week, is the question of, does God exist? So this is like the first tier, the top filter for sorting out religious viewpoints. It's like asking on which floor is the book located. Or if you were sending a letter, it's like asking on which continent does a person live. Right now, it may seem like sort of an academic issue, but we'll see today that it has very practical implications for how you approach life. And so we'll see, as we begin to map out the maze, 3 responses today. We'll hear from an atheist, a Buddhist, and then I'll share my own response as a Christian. So we start with atheism. One Sunday morning a month, there's a group of volunteers that gather near the railroad tracks in downtown Kalamazoo. In fact, they're out there this morning. They hand out food and drinks, toiletries, and clothing. But rather than doing it in the name of some religious organization, they call themselves Atheists Helping the Homeless. Now, it's a nonprofit that has several chapters across the country. And I met with Keith Gasper, who started the effort here in Kalamazoo. And I asked him about the group's name. He explained this.
We had talked about not using the word atheist in the title, but then we thought, every church does because they're also promoting something. So we thought it would be a good opportunity to show that atheists aren't bad. And that, if you were to Google what percentage of the population is atheist or agnostic skeptic, you're looking at 15 to 30%. Now that's a pretty wide range because a lot of people just don't say it. A lot of people just keep their mouth shut because you will get blackballed for it. So we thought it would be important to put the name in there so that we could just show, hey, we're just like everybody else. If you were to ask 10 questions about any standard issue, we fall in the same line as everybody else. We celebrate the same holidays. We don't have any different traditions, really. And, so it was more to try to normalize something that people can sometimes find abrasive.
Now, that percentage Keith mentioned are people who say that they have no religious affiliation. A 2014 survey conducted by an organization called NORC at the University of Chicago placed that number at 21% in the United States. But a report on the study explains, quote, preferring no religion is not atheism, which is still very rare. In 2014, just 3% of Americans said they did not believe in God. So I asked Keith why he considers himself an atheist. Here's what he told me.
There are militant atheists who think there's no way there could be a God, where in general, I think the average atheist would fall more on an agnostic plane, to where we just want to see evidence. And, out of all the 6,000 gods that have been worshipped, we just want to see more that would make us say that, yes, we can confirm, or at least have reason to confirm, that this is the one. So I'm more agnostic than anything else.
Okay.
Because the thought of a higher power, there's no way that's not an option. Aliens putting us here, there's no way that's not an option. We don't know. So we're at a very neutral point.
Those militant atheists that Keith talked about typically come from the elite world of academia, the types of places that have Romanesque style libraries and that sort of thing. Keith's not a scholar. He works in construction here in town, but he still bases his worldview on the scientific method. He's looking for empirical data to show him whether there's something more. And that way of thinking can be traced far back in history to Aristotle in the 4th century BC. But it really began to take hold of Western society during the age of the Enlightenment, in the 17th and 18th centuries. It led many people to believe in philosophical materialism. That's the conclusion that life is nothing more than physical matter. The stuff that we can observe, the stuff that we could measure. And of course, on the other hand, there have always been what you might call practical atheists, people who live as if God doesn't exist, regardless of what they may claim to believe. So if you think there's nothing more beyond the material world, why bother helping others? I mean, when I asked Keith about the basis for his morality, here's what he told me.
I think you're going to find this with every religion and every belief. The easiest answer is do unto others as you'd want done to yourself. I don't want you to punch me in the face right now, which I can only assume that's reciprocating. So I think the big difference is when we're doing something like this, we believe that there is no afterlife, so this is our one chance to experience something. So even if somebody who is homeless, maybe they got into drugs, maybe they beat the heck out of their wife and got kicked to the streets after they got out of jail, even if they screwed up royally to get there, this is their one chance to experience something. So even if us helping can change one experience, one moment in one day and make that better, we just improved their life that much more.
So Keith thinks that morality is just common sense. But like any charity, his organization struggles to find enough volunteers and financial support. Now, science would suggest that we'll continue to evolve for the better through the progress of knowledge and technology. It's sort of the idea that salvation comes through education. And it holds out the hope that suffering will be minimized and that death will be prevented and held off. But could it ever overcome people's selfishness? Will human progress ever bring an end to conflict, to suffering, to death? Keith was honest about those struggles. He told me this.
There's things that you do lose. When grandma dies and there's that comfort of seeing her again, that gets kind of depressing at first. Like if somebody starts to realize that they don't feel like they believe, that depression is pretty common just because you do lose a lot of emotional crutches. So you kind of have to look at everything from a different angle and retrain your brain. It was kind of a long road, and it's not uncommon for people to struggle.
Mentioned that the library at USC was a memorial for a man who lost his son. I wonder if Edward L. Doheny Sr. was trying to overcome those same struggles after the tragedy and the grief he felt in losing his son. I mean, his donation to the school built this temple of human learning and progress. I don't know what his personal beliefs were, but from an atheist perspective, that is in some ways the best possible good deed. But is that the best one can hope for? As we move on to another part of the maze, we'll hear from someone who answers our question in the same way, but heads in a very different direction. Second response is that of Buddhism. Though it's not common in the United States. A 2015 study from the Pew Research Center claimed that roughly 7% of the world's population are Buddhists, so around 1 in every 14 people. Most of them live in East and South Asia. They account for 93% of the population in Thailand, 35% in Japan, and 18% in China. So to meet with a Buddhist, I needed to head east, but not quite that far. I found the SukokoJi Buddhist Monastery nearby in Battle Creek, Michigan. So a monk named Chiezan Tomczyk recounts how the organization came into existence.
So my teacher, the abbot here, is named SukokoJi. He was born and raised in Battle Creek. And in the early 1970s, he was introduced to the teachings of a Tibetan master. So as you know, there was the communist invasion of Tibet in the late 50s, and there was a huge diaspora. The monks, the citizens had to leave, and Trungpa Rinpoche somehow found his way to the United States and started teaching here. So SukokoJi met Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche in 1973 and really began practicing pretty intensively and went to seminary in 1980. And then Trungpa died young at 47. And that was in 1987. And then SukokoJi met his Zen master from Japan, Kobun Chino Roshi. So he'd been studying for decades. And it kind of started out as just a small study group here in town. He started in the 70s, people getting together, practicing meditation, reading about meditation and Buddhism. And kind of fast forward, I graduated college in 2012, and I had met SukokoJi a few years beforehand. And I said, I'm looking at, moving somewhere for a year to practice meditation before graduate school. I was planning on, going forward with a master's degree in geomorphology. And he said, well, why don't you move to Battle Creek? And I said, well, do you have a program? He said, no, but we could create one. So I was like, interesting. The other options were to move across the country, across the world. So I moved here in 2012, and under his guidance, started practicing meditation 6.5 hours a day. And very slowly it began to build. And right now we're at about 10 full-time residents.
So Buddhism traces back to a man named Siddhartha Gautama. He was thought to have been born around 563 BC. His father was a chieftain who reigned over a small district on the Indian slope of the Himalayas. And he was born into the Brahmin religion, which is sort of a precursor to modern Hinduism. His father kept him isolated from the world to protect him from seeing evil or suffering. And so when he finally realized what the world was like as an adult, he was so disturbed that he left his family and tried to seek answers through extreme asceticism. So he was regularly depriving himself of food, sleep, and shelter over a period of 6 or 7 years. But he realized that was really no better than his previous life of luxury. And so he came to seek what he called the middle way, until he finally experienced a moment of enlightenment. And so the title, the Buddha, means enlightened one. So how do Buddhists then relate to the Buddha? How do they think about him? Chiezan explains this.
The Buddha was not a god, not to be worshipped. He's not divine. He just represents, he saw something about his mind. He taught it to others, and somehow 2,500 years later, people are still trying to see what that is. So it's very much about looking closely at everything for oneself, to look very closely, but you also kind of have to look out for those tricks of ego. Like you can't just look at it out of your bias and your opinions and your prejudice, but to actually see the total package, not just what you're looking at, but who it is you think is looking, and that the whole space really is to be investigated.
So Buddhism is sort of an Eastern version of atheism. Its teaching is often summarized in what's called the Four Noble Truths. First, life consists of suffering. Second, everything is impermanent, ever-changing. So we suffer because we desire things that are impermanent. Third, the way to liberate yourself from suffering is by eliminating desire. And then finally, desire can be eliminated through what they call the Eightfold Path: right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right awareness, and right meditation. Chiezan summed up many of these ideas when I asked him about the basic problem that we face in life. He said this.
In Buddhism, the underlying problem is a belief in the solid self, that we function out of hope and fear, this constant struggle and warfare, hope and fear, hope and fear, hope and fear. And it is so suffocating. There's no room to breathe, there's no space, there's no ability to function. I think that the solution is variable, and it's really something I try to be very careful about. Buddhism's not a religion that proselytizes. So I know for me, meditation practice seems to help me get to the root of that so that I can live a kinder life.
So secular atheism pursues knowledge to overcome suffering and death. It's propelled by hope and fear. But Buddhism is all about letting go, about giving up desire to passively accept suffering and death. Chiezan told me this.
It seems that when that transition comes, when it's time for this body-mind to go back into the elements, it seems like if you can be very clear about what you're looking at, that transition can be a lot more smooth. It seems a lot of times there's so much fear around death that the moment of death is very chaotic for some people. And perhaps with a little more what we would call mind training, that there might be some ability to see what's happening.
So there are different branches of Buddhism with views that differ from what we've heard from Chiezan. Some people believe, some Buddhists believe in reincarnation, that they have to sort of keep going around until they finally achieve enlightenment. We'll talk more about that concept next time as we talk about Hinduism. But by way of contrast, let me explain now where I stand in the maze compared to the worldviews of secular atheism or Buddhism. So our third response is the response from Christianity. And I think the Christian worldview can be summed up by the story of three trees. The first is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The book of Genesis begins the Old Testament by saying that God created the heavens and the earth. It doesn't present any evidence, it just makes an assertion. He also created the first man and woman and placed them in a fruitful garden where they could live forever. So Genesis 2, verses 16 and 17 tell us, the Lord God commanded the man, saying, "You may surely eat of every tree in the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." So God gave them a responsibility. He gave them a command with negative consequences if they ignored it. But then the next chapter, chapter 3, tells us that they were tempted by a servant. Other passages later in the Scripture say that a rebellious angel named Satan was the one speaking through the serpent. And he convinced the woman to see God as an opponent who is keeping them from their full potential. Genesis 3, 4 and 5 tells us, "But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.'" And then verse 6 says, "So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate." So, in a sense, they became practical atheists in that moment. They made their decision based solely on empirical knowledge, right? What they were able to gather as they stood there looking at the tree. And they chose to disregard God's command, to follow their own desire. And then the rest of the chapter speaks of the consequences. They experienced immediate shame, guilt, and then conflict. When God came to confront them, they tried to shift the blame. The man to the woman and the woman to the serpent. And God didn't strike them down, but the processes of sickness and death entered the world. They began at that moment. And they were passed on, of course, to all their descendants. So that first sin created a lasting division between humanity and God. So our conflict is not just with the external world. It's not merely an internal thing, as Buddhism says. Right? We are in a conflict against God himself. He doesn't appear to us in the same way that he appeared to Adam and Eve in the garden. And yet when we come to the New Testament, in Paul's letter to the Romans, he argues that the physical world still points us to the existence and character of God. In Romans 1, verse 20, Paul says, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse." And then as you keep reading in chapter 2 of Romans, verse 15, Paul says that we have the work of God's law written in our hearts, informing our conscience. That's where that sense of morality comes from. And so all of that should lead us to seek God. But we don't. Instead, we keep looking for ways to overcome suffering and sin on our own, in our own strength. But that leads us to a second tree. God has provided a solution for us in the cross of Jesus. We need a way to be cleansed of our sins and reconciled with God. And so he entered our world. He resisted sin. He taught truth. He experienced suffering and death, and then rose from the dead. And I'll say more about all those concepts as we continue through the series. But for now, let me just quote these prophetic words from verses 4 and 5 of Isaiah 53. The prophet looked ahead and said, "Surely he's borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his wounds we are healed." See, I believe that Jesus fulfilled that prophecy. He opened the way for us to draw near to God. But that doesn't mean that life is now free from suffering for us. Right? It's still hard. And yet we can, because of Jesus, we can pray to God and he hears us. We can trust that he's working through both the good circumstances and the bad ones in our lives to accomplish his good purpose. Which ultimately leads us to a third tree, the tree of life. Of course, the tree of life was part of the Garden of Eden. But when Adam and Eve sinned, human beings lost access to it. But when you go to the end of the book, when you skip ahead to the last 2 chapters of the book of Revelation, they talk about a new heaven and a new earth where that access is restored, where those who have been reconciled with God will live forever in his presence. So Revelation 21 verse 4 says, "He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away." So is there something more? Does God exist? It's not an academic issue. It has practical implications for how you handle suffering. Where do you stand in the maze? Do you need to move in a new direction? If you've never done so, do you need to start believing in God? If you want to learn more about the Christian response I've explained, I would direct you to some of the passages we've read, particularly Romans 1 and 2. If you're already a Christian, do you need to renew your trust in God's sovereign control, his power? You might find our recent study of the Psalms helpful in that, how to pray in hard times. Or perhaps this whole focus today would be a good springboard to start a conversation, a respectful discussion with a friend. Ask them about their view of God. Listen to them. See where they stand in the maze. And if it'd be helpful, you could share this series with them. May God grant us wisdom and understanding.